Now, as you'll have gathered from last week and this week, we are now in a series looking at the book of Esther. And last week, Jeff introduced the story to us, but I thought I would do a little introduction of my own as well to help us understand maybe where I'm coming from with looking at the book of Esther. Firstly, we are studying this book as when I was praying about where we go next, what series we do next, where God is calling us to go. I felt very much like the Spirit was saying to me to do the book of Esther. So one part of it is we are studying it as a matter of obedience, and we'll find out as we go along what God has in store for us, because it wouldn't have necessarily been an instinctive choice to choose Esther, I must admit. But after having committed us to Esther, I've been looking through and thinking about the direction we are going with it and how to do it, and chosen to do it as a chapter-by-chapter study. And I'm sort of slightly regretting that choice in the sense of it makes the work of the preacher quite difficult, because it's not the easiest book to go through, as main reason being it's a story that has an overarching theme that runs through the story, rather than being a book of lots of little stories or theological ideas. So as you go through the book, you're just entering into a part of this bigger story, whereas in a lot of the other books of the Bible, you do pick a chapter or a passage, and you've kind of got a standalone chapter or passage, and you can just draw out a sort of unique theological theme quite easily from the argument, or you're speaking about like a specific parable, for example. Whereas in this, it's a long thing, and we're doing it chapter by chapter, and so trying to make the sermons different each week is the challenge. But I do believe we'll get there, and the whole overarching theme will hopefully come through and be something that ends up being written in our hearts and help us going forward as Christians. And I must say, despite saying I regret it, it's good to have a challenge on that front. And it's a marvellous story that is found in the Bible. And some historical figures, big theologians, Martin Luther, for example, have struggled with this as a book in the Bible for various reasons. One big one being that it doesn't mention God through the whole book of the Bible. And some people just wonder why it's there. But as a book, it's a wonderful story, and we'll see as we go through why it's actually such a valuable book of our scriptures. But one of the big things of this book is it helps explain the origins of a Jewish feast called Purim, which is a feast which happens just before Passover in the calendar year, and it has a very similar theme to Passover in that it's a celebration of deliverance. But the big difference between Purim and Passover is Purim is a celebration which is quite a lively celebration, very upbeat celebration, whereas the feast of Passover is a much more solemn occasion. And so they're quite contrasting. And my hope is that as we get towards Advent and Christmas, which is when we'll come to conclude the studies of this book, it will actually help us draw into the coming season of Advent and Christmas. As we go through, we'll hopefully begin to see there's some relationships between sort of the Feast of Purim and Christmas, between Esther and what we remember through Advent and celebrate at Christmas. And as I say, this is a story rather than a book of stories. And it's not just those nice, tidy theological thoughts separated by sections. So one way I want us to think about this book as we look through the series is it's a bit like maybe a theatre production or a film, or even better, maybe a TV series, where each week we're going to look at a different scene of the story, which will build up the whole picture for us, and we will dig into the scene each week. And so the 10 weeks we look at this, because there's 10 chapters, it's like 10 episodes of a series as we go through. And for those who maybe follow these things, there's a new Harry Potter TV series being created, which will be a series on each book. Now, we've had the films of Harry Potter, and you sit down, you watch them in one go, but actually as you watch the film, you realise a lot of the details of the books are left out because they're trying to condense it into these like 2-hour films. But Instead, we're going to see through the TV series of Harry Potter, we're going to see the story in more detail and over an extended period of time, section by section. And in many ways, that is what we're doing with the book of Esther. We could sit down and do it all in one, maybe 2 sessions, but actually we're going to enjoy it over this extended period and allow ourselves to be immersed in the world of Esther, so that we, by being immersed in this world, that we may see God. And that's very significant, that point about that we may see God, because I've already mentioned God is absent in this book in terms of in language. If you weren't careful reading it, you could miss the fact this is a story about a great God. There's no grand miracles. There are no prophets. There are no dreams and visions. There is silence. We just see a messy string of events unfold. And yet through these events and God's absence in the story, we actually see a God who is faithful to his people and a God who is at work in their deliverance. And that's a story, I think, which should resonate with many of our lives. We long for signs of wonders of God, for deliverance that comes with power and might, like we hear about in the past. And yet many of us, we find ourselves genuinely living in a time of silence, wondering where God is. Maybe we hear stories of great moves of God and wonder why in our own lives God can feel so quiet. Or maybe we've been praying for years and we still haven't seen the fruit of that prayer yet, and wondering, how is God allowing these things to go on? Because we can't see what he is doing. And it's into those moments that this book is speaking into, the messy world that we live in. And we've seen the chaotic world that we live in just this last week. And we maybe wonder, where is God in all of this? This book speaks into a life which is very real for so many of us. It teaches us of how God is present despite the seeming absence. How God is at work to bring about the deliverance of his people, not necessarily through moves of visible power, but through his providence. That is his ordering of events and circumstances, and that how God is faithful to his people, even when we can't see it ourselves in the moment. And my hope is that this series will help us to grow in our trust for God, and for that trust to draw us closer to him, and to lead us to be more devoted in prayer, to be more devoted in spending time with him. And to do so not because we think it is a work that will achieve something, but because we have rediscovered our love and trust of the one who is our deliverer. And so let us now dig into the scene for us today in Esther 2. We heard in chapter 1 of King Xerxes, who was in a drunken rage, took some bad advice from his advisors after Queen Vashti had embarrassed him by refusing to come out and be paraded in front of many people to be ogled at. And so he cut her off for this action, for standing up for herself in many ways. He cut her off and passes a decree. And that decree, as we read it, will be appalling to us. It reduces the rights of women in the nation. And we should be stood there thinking, oh, this is a bad moment, because it was a bad moment. And we just heard that being passed, and we now move into chapter 2, our scene for today. And we are told that King Xerxes' fury had subsided. We don't know how long it took for it to subside. I imagine by the way it's worded, it's not necessarily just saying it was the next morning. It gives the impression that time had gone past. But I guess it would be possible that maybe he was in this drunken rage. He had maybe drunken enough to be hazy about the details, and it was just starting to come back to him what he had done in that rage. But say, we're not specifically told. We just know that this comes when he had calmed down. That rage he had, that decree he passed, he now remembers what he has done. And it suggests to me, actually, the way it's worded as well, it suggests to me there may have been a sense of regret to his actions. Because when you have those moments and you remember, it's a bit like, oh, what have I just done? And that's what it feels like to me is being told. He's just decreed this thing, and once he has done a decree in this land, we are told a bit later that when he does a decree, it is absolute in the land. He can't go back on it. He has said it, it is done. There is nothing that could be done about it. And so his advisors are remembering this decree, and now they are putting his decree into action. They suggest a beauty pageant by gathering all the beautiful women in the land into a harem, and then the king can experience them all and decide who pleases him most. It is certainly scandalous, almost certainly scandalous back in that day too, but even more so by our standards today. And as a story, this would be really quite questionable as well by Jewish standards, which is why it makes it even more surprising when we read about Esther joining in with this pageant and being advised to by Mordecai. It's a surprise because it is a scandalous moment. But it's important to understand as well as we go through this story, this isn't intended to be a story of morality. It's not trying to teach us the rights and wrongs of this moment, which is why he doesn't pass comment on the morality of these moments. It is detailing the story, and we get to the detail, and we're meant to see this overarching picture. It doesn't pass judgment on ethics, just the events that happened, and we are to understand them as to why God actually used these moments, how God used these moments, despite the messiness of the world, for good. And it's meant to then speak into our lives, so we can see how God may be using the messy events that we see around us for good. Even when this world seems to be going down a slippery, dark slope, God can be using it for the purpose of deliverance. But before we are introduced to Esther and the action of this beauty pageant taking place and seeing all this purpose of God in this messy world, we are introduced to Mordecai. Mordecai is the co-lead of this story. Now we are told Mordecai is the son of Jair, who is the son of Shimei, who is the son of Kish. And I'm so sure you are all sat there thinking, oh yes, Jair, Shimei and Kish. That sets up Mordecai nicely for this key role in the story. Now, I will help you along here. Kish was the father of King Saul. King Saul was the first king of Israel, who ended up actually being a bit of a bad king and spent a lot of his time trying to kill King David, who was to be king after him. And then you've got Shimei we're told he's a Benjamite. He was in the tribe of King Saul. He was probably related to him. And we also know about Shimei, he also opposed King David. And King David was the king of Israel, the good king of Israel, the model king, the one who was after God's own heart. He was the good king. Saul was his opposition. Shimei was his opposition. And the bad kings that came after, and those who opposed the reign of King David, they're the ones who led Israel into the exile that they find themselves in, into this captivity. And so we're seeing a bit about these people, and you may be like, why is Mordecai so linked to these people? And then we get Jair, who actually we know very little about. But his name means that he shines. And there's some thought maybe he's being mentioned because it gives a glimpse of actually what Mordecai is going to do in this story, how he is going to contrast to the son of Kish, to contrast to King Saul, how he's going to contrast to Shimei. And you may wonder why this all matters. Well, in our scene, we say we don't know much about Mordecai and what is to follow in this specific scene, but it does tell us that Mordecai, one, he is from a line of royalty. He's from a line of kings in Israel, albeit a line which opposed the great king of Israel. But it shows the continuity of this story with the history of Israel, the setting up of God's providence of overseeing his people. We see that he was there from the first king, and he's still there acting now, many hundreds of years later, in exile too. And it also shows, I think, where Mordecai he's going to be significant because he is possibly going to be succeeding where this lineage has failed. It sets us up to think Mordecai is going to be something different to those who he comes after. And with knowing the story, it also is going to show us how God can use somebody from a complicated and messed up background to fulfill his purpose. Because we know that's where the end of the story is going. God can use the messiness of someone's background, the messiness of whoever that person is. Someone who the people of Israel may think there's no hope for that lineage anymore. And God's going to draw somebody out from there. And I do wonder if the people who initially was hearing this story, if without knowing where the story was necessarily going, if there would have been this anticipation of Mordecai at this moment, that actually maybe he was going to be a bit of a baddie. Maybe this is a story of someone who's going to be a baddie and there's going to be a setup to overthrow him as well. Or maybe a bit of a groan, oh, here we go again, Saul's line, oh, bad people. I mean, maybe you slightly can understand this later on in the gospel with, when it was heard that Jesus was from Nazareth. Oh, has anything good come from Nazareth? That sort of groan there. Maybe it was sort of groan that may be coming here as well, the line of Saul. It may be a bit like finding out, just to put this into maybe a bit of pop culture, and the start of Les Mis, where Jon Valjean, a criminal released from prison, he even goes on to steal from a monastery. We may be thinking, if you didn't know where the story was going at this point, that actually this guy, you may be thinking he's not actually going to be the hero. And it's that moment when you find out that actually, oh, maybe this guy is going to be the hero. He's going to be turned around. He's been a bit misunderstood. And it brings us into the story. It draws us in. And maybe the original heroes of this story would have been a bit like Javert and couldn't understand how Mordecai could become the good guy. And maybe it convicted many of them, like Javert does at the end when he realises Jean Valjean was the good guy and he was being chasing after him despite all the law that he stood strong for. And then moving on from that point, we see at the start of chapter 3, which comes next week, we see an importance about this lineage as well. It says the enemy, it sets up the enemy of Mordecai. That's where we get to next week. Is going to be Haman the Agagite. And again, obviously you all sat there being like, yes, we know why that's important, that Haman is an Agagite. Because we're all Old Testament scholars, I know this. But the Agagites, just to fill you in maybe there as well, the Agagites, they are where King Saul failed in his kingship. It's because of saving King Agag, he didn't destroy him as was commanded, that Saul is rejected as the king of Israel. He is rejected because of what becomes the Agagites. And so seeing the Agagites being the enemy of Mordecai, we see it makes stronger that point of the contrast. And if you're wondering about where you find out about King Agag and his story, it's 1 Samuel 15, if you wanted to read it. And so early on in our story, Mordecai is being set up as this person of importance, of this person who is perhaps going to undo the failures of Saul, and he's going to help bring about the deliverance of Israel. It's going to go from Israel being rejected, from the line of King Saul being rejected, to the line of King Saul in Israel being delivered and brought back. It's a reversal story, and we're seeing it right here in chapter 2. And it really echoes the story of the gospel, the story that we know so well of Jesus Christ, who has come, the one who ends up being rejected, but he comes to deliver his people, the people who may have been rejected. They're going to be the ones who are saved, who are called back to God and to salvation. And we also know the story of Jesus. He is the one who is deemed to be the second Adam, the one who was born in obscurity, born in human flesh. He is going to succeed where Adam and the rest of humanity has failed. And he's going to bring deliverance once and for all for God's people in the midst of a very messy world. The line of Adam the one who sinned, the one who was rejected by God for his disobedience, a bit like the line of King Saul. Through that line is going to come the salvation of the people who are in spiritual exile. They're going to be brought back into the spiritual land of God. It's a wonderful story, and it echoes this so beautifully in the book of Esther. And we're going to see that. We can see that already at the start by the description of Mordecai. But then quickly moving on, because of time, I want to cover quickly the introduction of Esther and then the glimpse of providence that we get in this scene right at the end. But we're not going to linger too long. So after Mordecai, we finally get to Esther, the star of the show the book is named after. We learn that she was looked after by Mordecai. It's a story of adoption. Again, reminiscent of wider stories of the Bible and salvation, but it's reminiscent particularly of the story of Ruth. Ruth, who was, it wasn't quite a full adoption, but she went to with Naomi, who wasn't her birth mother, and to live with her and become as a daughter to her. It's a similar sort of story. And it's worth noting as a whole that this story is written in a way which is reminiscent of the book of Ruth. It's written similarly to the story of Joseph in Genesis, rather than the books of, say, Judges or Exodus, which are quite different in their approach to telling the story. Again, it's the overarching story that we are getting. And this point of adoption, it's a significant theme in the full story of salvation. Again, an outsider who is valued by God, an outsider who's been given love, being given compassion, who's been raised up into this great position to help the people of God. It's similar, so much echoes of our story of salvation. We also learn that she was faithful to Mordecai. She was a model daughter, effectively, and that she was very blessed in the looks department is effectively what we are told. And that's going to be a key factor for her getting into a position of influence and bringing about the deliverance of the people of God. It's another act of providence or supposed coincidence of how this person got into position. It's telling us these reasons without casting any sort of aspersions on it. And we see that she won the favour of everybody, partly by her looks and I imagine by her personality as well. And this leads her to winning her beauty pageant, as we're referring to it, and being crowned queen. And importantly, though we won't go into it today, but there will be opportunities further down the line as we study this book, there is a banquet which is thrown for Esther and a holiday proclaimed. And these banquets which get thrown, they become an important part of the story. They're significant scenes and markers in the story of Esther. So when we hear about banquets later on, we know these are important moments. And so we are here, we're introduced to the character of Esther and see how she rises to significance, to be in a place to influence the deliverance of God's people. And then finally we come back to Mordecai, and it's a great moment of providence. Mordecai happened to overhear a plot while sat at the king's gate, as he did, by two angry guards, and they planned to assassinate King Xerxes. Now, we are sadly fully aware of the seriousness of this plot, considering the circumstances and situation in America this week. We know how serious and how devastating this is and how bad this moment is. But Mordecai, in this moment, he heard the plans and told Queen Esther, who was now conveniently positioned to tell the king. And Esther goes on to tell the king and lets the king know that it was Mordecai who foiled the plot. And so the scheme was ended. And we find out as well down the line, a bit later in the book, that this moment gives Mordecai favour with the king. This moment, it sets up this great position for Esther and Mordecai to then bring about the deliverance of the people of Israel. Due to the very convenient circumstances and the shambles of the reign of King Xerxes, we are seeing how God may be putting things in place for the favour of his people. And in the moment, as maybe we might feel being stuck in this scene, in the moment, it will be hard to see that it's God at work. If we're fully immersed in the scene, we'll be like, this is all horrible. This is all horrendous. The king's doing bad things. The treatment of women isn't right. There's plots to assassinate the king. This country is in a place of mess. It is in a state. And in this scene, and you're just there like, what is going on? And it's only when everything comes together that it all becomes clear. This mess that we see, and this mess that we see around us in our life, that doesn't stop the fact that God is at work. For our lives today, God is putting things in place for deliverance of his people, which has been won on the cross by Jesus Christ. We may not see it in sort of the current scene we are in the story and in our life, but how often we will look back on circumstances and we clearly see God's providence at work in hindsight. And it should teach us that in this moment, God is putting things in place, even if you cannot see it yet. And to mention that assassination again, one of the things that has come out of it is a lot of people have picked up their Bibles and started reading them as a response to this moment. It's a dark moment, a bad moment, as all killings are, all murders are, regardless what political circumstances they are. It's bad. But you can see already that God maybe is going to use a great evil for something good by drawing people to him. And may I encourage you today to try trusting God. Try trusting him. You may find your circumstances are hard. It may be difficult. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. It may be difficult if you're thinking God's a bit silent today. But try trusting him. Because he is working things for good. He is working things for your deliverance, as we're seeing in this book of Esther. And actually, God allows you to lay it all down before him, to let him know that you are finding it hard. He's not asking you to cover it up. He's asking you to just lay it before him. He's going to hear your prayers. He is working for you. And the Bible assures us that he is collecting up all our prayers and that he hears them with compassion. The Bible assures us of that. And maybe each day this week you can reflect on the circumstances of your day and ponder on what God might be up to in your life through those circumstances you find yourself in. How might God be using the strange and messy circumstances in your life and in this world to bring about his salvation plans? Be thinking about those things this week. Maybe be reflecting longer term back as well, because as I say, so often when we look back we can see, actually, I was in this position at this point. If that didn't happen, I would never have had this happen, and never this happen, and I would not have come to know God. And when we do that, when we look in hindsight, we can say, actually, only God could have put these things in place. And so let us reflect on those things and give praise to God, a God who is at work, even in the silence, a God who is always working and will bring about the deliverance of his people. Amen.